Hi, I'm SharpFLA. Today I'm going to show you how to do this technique developed by my friend Brian Rosner and Genus Griggs alongside me. It's all about spinning your texture coordinates. There are some situations where you want to create a spiral effect. Maybe you want to have a leather wrap to a handle, or maybe you want to create something that looks like a vortex. In order to do that, you need to know how to spin your texture coordinates. I'm going to show you what that means and how to do it. The basic idea behind coordinate spinning is using one coordinate to spin another coordinate. So you can use your x to spin your y, or your y to spin your x, or your x to spin your z. The idea is that as one of these numbers goes up, you're using it to change the position of another one of these numbers. In this case, imagine that as we go alongside of this vortex texture right here, we're saying we want things to go further to the left. So the further you go this way, the more you go this way. The critical node in this setup is going to be our vector displace node, and I'll show you how to use that in just 1 second. First, let's create a little demo project to get things going. To get things started, let's get rid of the cube and create a new cylinder. The reason why we're going to create a cylinder is because it's essentially already set up for us. You could do this with a number of other setups, but the cylinder is just the easiest way to go about it. And I'll show you what I mean in just 1 second. If I go to the UV editing menu, we'll be able to see the way that our UVs are already laid out for this cylinder. You can see that all these side faces are going along this way, and we don't really need to care about the top faces right now. What we're going to do is we're going to turn face selection on by hitting 3. Then we're going to deselect everything, hit Option, select all of these faces, and we are going to go to our bottom row of vertices, and we're going to bring them down by hitting G and Y. And the reason why we're doing this is essentially we're taking these side faces and projecting them along a 2D plane. So if I click this face right here, and then I click the face next to it, they appear next to each other in our UV editor. The reason why this is important is because we're going to use their position on our UV map to distort their position posthumously. Next, we're going to go to our shader editor. Once we get to our shader editor, we're going to create a new material. In order to demonstrate what I mean by UV spinning, we're going to first create a wave texture. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to type in wave texture, and create it. Make sure that you have Node Wrangler on for this. You can turn on Node Wrangler by going to Add-ons, typing in Node Wrangler, and hitting the check mark. I'm going to hit Shift and Control and click so I can preview this texture. Right now I'm getting these bands of waves across my cylinder. This is because it's currently using the generated coordinate. We're going to change that by hitting Control and T to automatically place these texture coordinate nodes and this mapping node. We could do this manually by hitting Shift A and finding these nodes ourselves, but this is why we use Node Wrangler. It's just a little bit easier. What we're going to do for this demo is instead of using the generated coordinate, we're going to use the UV coordinate, and that's going to reference the coordinate system that we just made. So we plug UV into vector, and that goes into our wave texture, which goes into our output. And we get this result. We get these straight stripes going across the entire side of our cylinder right here. The next thing that we have to do for this is spin the actual UVs. Let me show you what that means. So in Blender, the fantastic thing is that we're only really ever dealing with 2 types of information. We're only really dealing with either shader information, what comes off of things like the principled BSDF, diffuse BSDF, all those kinds of things, and color information. But we use color information in a wide variety of different ways. We don't just use it to make things that appear on the surface of our object, we also use it for modifying the position of textures. So if I want to see that UV texture that I just made, it's going to appear to us as color information. And we can preview that by hitting Control and Shift and clicking on our texture coordinate node until we get to the UV slot. Now that I see this, I can start to see that my x-axis is being represented by this green color right here, and my y-axis is being represented by this red color here. What Blender is doing is using these color values to represent directions for our coordinates. Then, eventually, our texture coordinate node is going to take those color values and decide, okay, at this location, I need to put this particular color for black or white for our wave texture. What we're going to do is use these different values and manipulate them to have a different result to go into our wave texture. We're modifying them before they end up in our wave texture so we can get that spun appearance. The way that we're going to do that is by using our vector displace node. I'm going to hit Shift A, and before I put in the vector displace, I have to separate these values by using a separate XYZ. So if I get my separate XYZ, and I put that before my UV texture, I'll be able to see that on my X value, I get this gradient going across until it eventually reaches this maximum point right here and goes back to 0. And if I Control Shift click and go to my Y, I'll see that it increases as I go up and along my cylinder. I'm going to move these over here by selecting them and hitting G to move. And now we're going to break out the titular vector displace node. So I'm going to take this vector displace. I'm actually going to input the X value into the vector of our vector displace. Then I'm going to input the Y value into the mid-level of the vector displace. And you'll already start to notice that there's this spinning action happening right here. But this isn't exactly what we want. Before we start inputting this into our wave texture, we first want to set it from, instead of being tangent space, we want to set it to world space. So now this is going to be our output. So now that we have this displaced output, we're going to combine these once again with our old coordinates. So we've separated everything into these black and white values that are easy to manipulate, and we're going to combine them together in just 1 second. The way that we do that is by using a combine XYZ. We get that by hitting Shift A, hitting XYZ, and selecting combine XYZ. And we're going to put that at the end here. We're going to make sure that our displaced coordinates, this one right here, is going into our X value, and our non-displaced Y value, the one that was going up as a gradient, is going into our new Y value. And the way that that is going to look is like this. We have our red Y value that's continuing to go up as we go into the distance, and we have our new spun X value. We're going to be able to mess around with this by first deleting that mapping node, and then taking our wave texture that we already have and putting it between our output and our combine XYZ. All that's doing is taking the UV map that we just made all at the beginning, it's separating it out into these different values, using those values to spin itself, taking that X value and then modifying it by the Y value, and then outputting that into this combine XYZ right here, combining it with the old Y value, and then feeding that into a wave texture. Here's our input. This separates those inputs. This modifies one input by another input. This combines our inputs back together, puts them into this wave texture, and then goes to our output. Now this is pretty cool on its own, but we're not quite done yet. If we start to modify this scale, because let's say we want our wave texture to be a little bit less tight than it currently is, we can turn the scale value down, but if we move around, we'll see that there's this big seam right here. And we don't necessarily want that, because if we try to map something else to the output of this wave texture, it's going to look kind of weird. The way that we get rid of that seam is by, instead of just inputting a random scale value like this one, we're going to put in a special scale value by using the number pi. So the way that we do that is by creating a math node by hitting Shift A and typing in math. Now we have this math node. We're going to set the math node to multiply. And we're going to type into the first value the number pi by hitting P, I, and then enter. And that's automatically going to put the number pi in there. We're going to take the value output and we're going to plug that into the scale of our wave texture. And now, no matter what we set the second value of this multiply to, we're never going to get a seam. So we're always going to have a number that leads to a perfectly smooth spiral right around our pillar right here. The best part is because this is a black and white value and we are really only using colors when we're messing around in Blender, we can take this and we can feed this back into another combine XYZ. So let's take our old combine XYZ, let's hit Shift D to duplicate it, and put it after our wave texture. Let's make sure that it's taking the factor output, and that is going into the X value here, and we take that old Y from the beginning, and we put into that new combine XYZ. Now we have something that looks like this. And after this, let's get rid of that principled BSDF. Let's put a noise texture. And the way that this is going to look is that now it looks like the noise texture is spinning around our cylinder here. We can change the scale of the noise texture and do whatever we want to it, and it's always going to look like it's spinning. And we can always go back and modify the value on our multiply here to make it bigger, to make it smaller. And that's how you spin your texture coordinates. And you can use that to create all kinds of cool effects like I did in this portal effect. I'm going to open that file one more time. This portal effect basically works on the same basic principles. If I go into the node group that I created for it, you can start to see that it's taking those UVs. It's doing a little bit of extra stuff to avoid looping in the noise texture, but we don't need to worry about this here. We can talk about that in another tutorial. It's doing the same thing with the vector displacement, feeding that into a wave texture, and then combining that back with the old coordinates. Then there's a bunch of wild masking stuff that happens that we don't need to get into right now, but the idea is essentially the same. So I can use that spinning technique to create all kinds of cool effects. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you like my videos. Check out my Twitter at @sharp_FLA. Suggest topics that you'd like me to cover in the comments, and bye!